Welcome to New Atlas Live. I'm Brian Berletic. Today is September 2nd, 2023. Joining me today is my co-host who's been missing
New
for a
Atlas
while.
Live.
Now
I'm
he's
Brian
back.
Berletic.
Today is September 2nd. Angelo does it every single time. Angelo Giuliano is my co-host, and our special guest today is Scott from Kalibrated. Welcome to you both. Where do we want to start? We want to definitely start with Ukraine, I think, and then we'll get into Niger, and then we'll probably touch on the Pacific a little bit. Let's start with Scott. Scott spends a lot of time in the trenches of Telegram and Twitter, and he goes through a lot of what is actually somewhat open source intelligence. What have you been seeing these days, the last 1 or 2 weeks?
So just in terms of the counteroffensive, which is the primary event going on right now in Ukraine, there's a lot of talk about the Ukrainians finally making it to possibly past the first line of defense. It looks like most of the movement has stopped around Bakhmut for the Ukrainians. I think that the sort of the calculus there is not working out, so they've pulled back. There's been a lot of Russian pressure up in the north in the LPR on the east side of the Oskal River, so a lot of force rotation was forced in that area. And then but the primary focus continues to be around this small town of Robotny. It is now, I believe, fully captured. The Russians still control the heights to the south of the town. The Ukrainians are in sort of a fire pocket in this low valley. But the big news is that, there was a Ukrainian deep reconnaissance group that had gotten past one of the lines of defense through geolocation. We know that. And so a lot of the hype in the pro-Ukrainian information space right now is focused on that. We also had one of the largest drone attacks to date inside of Russia, up in the north. An airfield that was hosting IL-76s was hit. At least 2 were damaged. I think 1 burned down completely. But considering that this is not really a part of the war in Ukraine right now, it's kind of an unrelated target, sort of a soft target, in my opinion. And the interesting thing is nobody really knows where these drones came from that attacked this airbase. At first, the Ukrainian government said that they were launched from inside Ukraine. They had traveled some 700 kilometers up to this airfield, which is just probably not what happened at all. And then there were some rumors that they were launched from sea, launched from inside of Russia, or launched possibly from somewhere in the Baltics, Estonia maybe, which would have very large implications on the situation. So we're still waiting for an investigation to come out on that. But mostly what's going on right now is a lot of distractions, a lot of deflections from the rather unpleasant failing counteroffensive, which was the hype from, last fall through the spring. It was supposed to be a spring counteroffensive, turned into a summer counteroffensive, and now we're looking at an autumn counteroffensive. It's September 1st. I just put out a tweet today that was basically saying, who would have guessed that on September 1st we would be talking about the 82nd Brigade valiantly fighting for Robotny and Vorobe and the town just south of it. It's just not what people expected. The 9th Corps didn't do hardly anything. The 47th Mechanized Brigade didn't hardly do anything. And now you're using your exploitation brigades as breakthrough brigades. And it's not the direction I think the Ukrainians want to be going in right now.
These are actually the last of the brigades that Ukraine prepared for this offensive. So it's important for people to understand that they still have not broken through the first of several Russian defense lines in the south. There are also several layers of defenses in the east. They're talking about trying to get Bakhmut. There are defenses to the east of Bakhmut that they would have to go through. So really, let's just go and take a look at the headlines. While I get the headlines up, Angelo, what are you paying attention to regarding the offensive right now?
Actually, I have a question for you too, especially for Scott. I'm thinking in terms of accounting. Here we had the starting army And then it increased. There was some training for the one that were trained in the West, and also in terms of weapons, all the hardware. Is there any way that we actually can do some type of accounting in terms of? I mean, I know it's bad. We're talking about lives here, but beginning army, the killing actions and so on. This is for the army, and also all the materials. And in terms of what can be done in also a projection in the future. At this rate, we are talking about 1,000 men killed in action, wounded every day, and how you can replenish what you had before, how you can replenish, and how much do you need to train to make it sustainable. And the same for the weapons. We are talking about diminishing. What they've been sending to Ukraine is going to be diminishing. So what is the point where we could say, well, you know what, at this rate, it will be unsustainable to keep on going like this at this rate. Is there any study being done by this, Scott?
Yeah, so I mean, this is the $1,000,000 question, right? Everybody wants to know what the Ukrainian losses are. Unfortunately, with how strong Ukrainian censorship is, we can only really guess at that. There are people who count losses in terms of material, artillery, armored vehicles, tanks, so on and so forth. And Ukraine has lost a substantial number of their original starting equipment for this counteroffensive. But once again, we're in a situation where the Russian information space is very shallow when it comes to footage. The Ukrainians tend to film everything. A lot of the losses we see actually from the Ukraine conflict are the Ukrainians filming it themselves. It's a real weakness, I would say, of the Russian MOD in this conflict because there is a lot more going on that we're just not ever seeing. So in terms of material, I think we have a pretty good count on it. And the Ukrainians are definitely hurting in some areas. Every time you see a self-propelled gun or a 155 howitzer get destroyed, that is a crucial loss being taken away from the Ukrainian military. But in terms of starting army, where they are now, it's really unknown. We have no idea how much mobilization is going on. We have no idea how much training is occurring outside, in the country. Outside of the country, we know that that they're not able to produce the quality combat effective units that they need to. We've seen that through the counteroffensive. I mean, they were up against a pretty difficult task, but there has been less than expected progress for sure. When you talk about like a breaking point, I think it's going to be on the failure of this counteroffensive. They're going to try to make this little gain, whatever they make, even if let's say they make it to Tokmak, that would be a wildly successful situation from where they are right now. They only have a couple of weeks before the mud starts, churning in Ukraine. So offensive operations are really going to slow down in the south. I think that once there's kind of this feeling that the Ukrainian counteroffensive has actually failed, in the West, we're going to start to see the diminished support. We're going into an election year. Biden is going to have a very hard time getting reelected if he's constantly sending, $1 billion in arms and, billions in financial support. So I really think that that's going to start slowing down unless there is some, catastrophic defeat for the Russians somewhere that they can piggyback on. And as that support starts to diminish, at first it's going to come in the form of, tanks and the larger stuff that costs a lot of money, air defenses, things like that. The West is pretty much at their limit already with a lot of this stuff. I mean, we're seeing Germany trying to bribe Greece for their 100 Leopard 1A5s, which is a 1950s model tank. I mean, it's not going to do anything that, the 2A4 and the 2A6s, they accomplish nothing as well. So you're already seeing it. This counteroffensive was really the last major influx of weapons I think you're going to see from NATO into Ukraine. You're still going to see this stuff that is going to try to maintain the fight for as long as possible, but I don't think you're going to get these large reserves being put into the country for future offensives. This is going to be a run out the clock situation for the West, and they're going to try to do it as cheaply as possible. And when it comes to, trained manpower, Ukraine is now starting to mobilize. They've put out requests to businesses, universities, stuff like this. They're going to start recruiting basically what I would consider the bottom of the barrel when it comes to manpower. The people that have avoided being drafted have not volunteered this entire time. They're the people that have bribed their way out of the situation. They are now on the chopping block to be sent to Ukraine. I think you're going to see a lot more domestic struggle with that, and it's going to produce less and less combat effective units. The training is not going to be substantial, and you're already seeing issues in training. We've had 2 air collisions now in the Ukrainian Air Force. One was I think it was the IL-39 training aircraft in the Zhytomyr region. I mean, these were the pilots that were getting set up for the F-16s. I don't know how that's even going to work. I don't know why they're even focusing on that so much, but that's like the next thing, I believe, along with these Abrams that are just also not going to do anything. There's only 31 of them that you can only cover so much ground. So
if you identified some bottlenecks, we know that there were some problems with ammunition. So ammunition was a bottleneck.
Yeah.
Now my question is, within weapons, there must be some bottlenecks, because you need to source everything together. There's some kind of logic there, and sometimes you miss more of some of the material. So I was thinking about in terms of ammunition. And the second question would be, would they be running first, to your opinion, in running out of weapons before men, or the opposite? What do you think? What is the most critical, weapons or people?
In my personal opinion, it's going to be manpower, men for sure. You're already seeing the counteroffensive is starting to pull back in some areas because they don't have the force disposition to cover where the Russians are pushing up in the north, right? So the Bakhmut offensive, the offensive on the ledge down in between Donetsk and Zaporozhye have both kind of ceased the intensity in that area, which is not good news, because then the forces in around Robotny are going to have Russian reserves being pushed over from other areas that are not being contested, and can further slow that down and bog that down and destroy that. So definitely, I think it's going to be manpower. There's always going to be MRAPs being delivered. There's always going to be armored vehicles. Tanks will become an issue, I believe. The more and more of these Soviet vehicles that are lost in the Ukrainian army, the worse the situation is going to get. Everybody's always focused on the Western equipment, but really what Ukraine utilizes the best is the stuff that they were trained on super well, the stuff that they know. And that's going to be the T-72s, which are, similar to the T-64s that they had, and those sort of vehicles. So once that starts running out, which it will eventually, you're going to really start to see bottlenecks in the armored, support department. Another major bottleneck right now is going to be air defense missiles, which the U.S. has not increased production hardly at all, that we know about at least, and radar systems. There have been no orders placed for these. It's extremely difficult for the West to really come online because they have to build factories, right? And none of these companies want to invest in these factories, because if the Ukraine war ends tomorrow, they're stuck holding that bill for that factory where they're not producing anything that's being sold, right? So it's like a huge investment. If there was a promise that this would be going on for 5 more years and the U.S. would get involved somewhere else, maybe these factories would get built. But we're just not seeing orders go in for these factories. We're not seeing orders being placed for weapon systems that Ukraine is desperately in need of. Obviously, aircraft is a bottleneck, but I think that the Ukrainian Air Force is basically mute at this point. It's relegated to long distance missile launching, which has its effect, but there's not enough Storm Shadows flying around. For every one Storm Shadow that flies into Russian ammo dumps or whatever, you have 5 or 6 Russian missiles flying back the other way. So it's just never going to balance, and so that'll be a bottleneck. In terms of ammunition, we just don't know what the U.S. is producing. the last I heard, the Ukrainians were firing between 2,000 and 3,000 shells a day, which is real low compared to at least the beginning and the prepping stage of the counteroffensive, where they were probably firing 6,000 to 10,000. But the Russians have been firing 6,000 to 10,000 every day. So it's the ammunition could be a bottleneck. I don't think we've seen it. I think that the guns will run out before the ammunition runs out, in my personal opinion. And, as these guns are less and less spread out, SPGs and howitzers, they're going to become more and more concentrated, more and more vulnerable. And, the progression of attrition will just increase.
Just maybe one more question. It's for the two of you. In case of a counter-offensive of Russia, is there any evidence of defensive lines? So similar to what Russia, the Surovikin line that Russia did, is there any evidence from the Ukrainian side that they've been starting building any type of defensive lines?
So in the Kramatorsk area, yes, they were building defensive lines there as, Bakhmut was beginning to look squishy. Seversk has been holding extremely well because these have, been the front line for a very long time. And they've really been able to dig in these areas. We don't see any satellite proof of fortifications in Kherson, in the Zaporozhye area. They have, they're already established fortifications, but nothing like the Surovikin line, nothing like that. Nothing like what's, east of Bakhmut. And then up in the north, no, it's wide open up there. They haven't really dug in anywhere, especially east of the Oskal River, because that area is very, very hard to hold. The logistics situation in that area is extremely difficult. So if you are expecting a Russian offensive, it would probably come from the north. I think the Ukrainians are expecting that. They've rotated a lot of mechanized brigades and Jaeger brigades up there to try to hold off this Russian offensive. I think we've seen Bradleys up there now. The CV-90s were up there. So the Ukrainians are definitely worried about this. As far as, a Russian counteroffensive, will it happen? Will it not? The Russians have been extremely slow moving. They're very loss adverse, so they don't want to sacrifice men in, dichotomy to what the Ukrainians are doing, where they're using manpower as their tool for success. The Russians are relying on drones, artillery, and aviation support for that.
Yeah, those are all very good points. And I was going to save this for a little bit later, but one of the things that I often hear, or a comment that I see in the comment section under my videos, is, Brian, you've been saying for months and months that Ukraine is running out of ammunition. But here, Ukraine is still fighting. And I actually agree with things that you've both said. They're never going to run completely out of men. They're never going to run completely out of ammunition. The West is making ammunition, and they'll always have some that they can send to Ukraine that Ukraine can use on the battlefield. The problem is they're not getting enough. They're not getting enough to implement any sort of offensive. When we can see that manifesting on the battlefield. The reason this offensive has failed is because they don't have enough materiel. They don't have enough ammunition. They don't have enough armor. They don't have enough of anything. So that is it manifesting on the battlefield, this running out of arms and ammunition that we keep talking about. Yes, they're still out there fighting, but fighting, how are they fighting? What are they accomplishing? What are they achieving? And we can see the answer is not much. They lost Bakhmut, they lost Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Russia is still holding a large percentage of Ukrainian territory that they've actually incorporated into the Russian Federation. So all of these are examples of how this has manifested itself. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's something that is going to gradually eat away at Ukraine's combat power. I don't know if anyone has anything they want to add onto that. I just wanted to go over the headlines that I was looking at earlier today. They're all basically the same. The New York Times, Ukraine's offensive makes progress. The Guardian, Ukrainian counteroffensive has made notable progress in South over past 3 days. U.S. says they're citing John Kirby, White House spokesman, and the BBC, same thing, even the same photo, Ukraine war, US sees notable progress by Ukraine army in south. Now, if I open the live map, it'll crash, and then I have to restart my computer. But I'm sure people have seen the maps where Ukraine had started this offensive and where they are right now and how much further they have to go. It is a huge amount of distance they still have to go, and they've hardly made any progress at all. So they're saying from going from nothing to maybe Robotino or Robotny, however, I'm really butchering that pronunciation. But reaching there, that is technically progress, but it is irrelevant compared to what they've expended on the battlefields. And then there's this, and Scott was just talking about this. Russia is making progress up in the north, near Kupiansk. And this is Russia risks dividing its forces. UK says they're saying Russia shouldn't be making progress up north because they're dividing their forces and maybe they won't be able to stop Ukraine in the south. But
it's always just the perfect projections, because what's happening is the Russians are not committing large force up in the north. They're not going on some massive offensive. The Ukrainians had talked about 500 tanks, 400 artillery pieces, 100,000 men up in this area. And the Russians have not committed any of that at all. They're not on some serious offensive up in the north yet. Everybody's sort of waiting for it because they think it's coming. But this is the same thing that happened in the winter. The Ukrainians did this whole hype campaign about a Russian winter offensive. 120,000 Russian troops, where all the mobilized men were going to come into play, when the mobilized men weren't even done training. They didn't finish until March. So there was no offensive coming. And then they, wrapped it up as, oh, the Russians failed in their offensive. And I think the same thing is kind of happening now. You have the Russian military just putting pressure on this area. Just it's like an active defense where they are attacking. They've spotted a weak point in the Ukrainian defenses. There's not very established Ukrainian defenses in this area. There's a lot of forest lines that the Russians can move through and conceal. And they are exploiting that and forcing massive Ukrainian force rotation. It has taken pressure off of Bakhmut, which was an incredibly costly area for both the Ukrainians and the Russians, especially on the southern flank around Kleshchivka. The fighting there was absolutely brutal for months. You had the Azov battalion there that got absolutely stomped out. You had multiple Russian units that took pretty serious attrition, just trying to defend this area because it's a very open and exposed area. So that pressure has ceased. And, when you force rotation up to a point where you're not really pushing with, a concerted number of men, then you're relieving pressure and you can move your forces. It's very smart what they're doing. And the Ukrainians have no answer for it just because they don't have enough trained manpower to be going on the offensive in Bakhmut, defending up in the north, and focusing their offensive down in the south. And I just wanted to add on to what you said earlier about, they're always going to have artillery. They're always going to have guns and stuff like that. Yes, that is true. And I just would like everybody to think to themselves for a second, what would happen if the Ukrainian artillery support brigade helping the 82nd or helping the 47th? What if they had the proper mine clearing equipment at the beginning of the offensive? These are all things that you have to take into your analysis. And that's why a lot of us said this Ukrainian counteroffensive is never going to pan out the way they want it to. They're going into an artillery disadvantage. They're going into an air power disadvantage. And it's only going to get worse because Ukraine is not getting the constant deliveries. Could you imagine if there were 8 more HIMARS firing 30 more rockets a week? That would be a considerable increase to what is currently going on. If there were 30 more Storm Shadow cruise missiles hitting logistics, a week, if there were, 30,000 more men that didn't die in Bakhmut, during that grinding episode for the last, it was from like January when they got around on the flanks to May. They held that for that long, forcing men into that little pocket. I mean, it was just unnecessary and I think ego-driven. And then now you're seeing the counteroffensive being severely weakened even because of that loss of manpower. I think about if you would have had that manpower to counterattack in Bakhmut, you could have actually taken back Kleshchivka, maybe done some damage in the northern flank, and then also had 10, 20,000 extra men for your push in the south. These are all things you have to take into consideration. And as this attrition continues, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. And the West is not delivering more than what's being lost. The only area I think that they are actually doing that in is IFVs, Bradleys and Strikers, and MRAPs, because the US has a lot of them. So they can continue supplying those. But the other periphery things that are really required to continue fighting are going to start degrading and degrading and degrading. You see almost no more S-300 systems. All of these air defense systems, Iris-T, S-300, Strela 10. There was like a genocide of Strela 10s recently on the front line. These are the things that are going to start creating massive holes. And as these massive holes are starting to widen, the losses in other areas are going to increase because you just don't have coverage.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good point. Do you remember when Russia was hitting the power infrastructure of Ukraine, and Ukraine had to mobilize their air defenses to try to stop this?
Yeah.
And they exhausted their air defenses in the process, and then they had, and between that and their systems being picked off over time, they were out of long-range air defense systems. This is when Russia began using glide bombs along the line of contact, and this significantly increased Ukrainian losses. Yeah. So that's a very good point that you just made there, Scott. That is exactly what's happening. And it's a process that takes time. It's not an episode of G.I. Joe where it wraps up after 30 minutes. This is going to be a long, long process. I don't think people understand the scale. I saw someone in the comment section saying that Russia is pathetic because they cannot take over this small country. Ukraine is big. It's much bigger in terms of geography and population, and in terms of its military capabilities than Iraq was. And think about how difficult that was for the United States. Think about how difficult Afghanistan was for the United States. And they didn't even have an army.
Yeah, and also think about, it's not just Ukraine. If it was just Ukraine, this would have literally ended in the first week. You need NATO satellites and NATO intelligence. You need NATO EU American financial support. Nobody understands that the entire Ukrainian government and the entire Ukrainian military is being paid for by the West right now, like pensions and salaries. All of that is coming from Western coffers, and that is weighing down the EU. The US can deal with it; they're fine. Obviously, we give billions every week. We just print it, but it's not Ukraine versus Russia. It is NATO using Ukraine as the battering ram, or the shield, however you want to look at it, against Russia, and trying to degrade them through the use of Ukraine. And that's what we have the saying, to the last Ukrainian, because the West doesn't care about Ukraine. It's not. It's a means to an end, and that's all it's ever going to be for the West.
Absolutely. Before I got started today, I was looking through Twitter. I was looking at what you have to put up with on a daily basis, Scott, and I noticed that the pro-Ukrainian universe on, say, Twitter, what they do is they cherry pick footage of Ukraine taking out Russian soldiers or equipment, which happens because it is a war and it is happening. They only show that. They show nothing about what is happening to Ukrainian forces, and they don't talk about the disposition of troops and equipment on both sides. And then right before we started, I was reading this from the New York Times, and it says, a brutal path forward, village by village. This is the New York Times. It's talking about, again, they just went up a couple of villages over the course of, now we're at 3 full months of fighting now. Yes, we're going into month 4 now, and that's all that they took.
Which General Ben Hodges said, a lieutenant general, I think, retired. He said Crimea by the end of summer. That was the whole thing. Crimean summer beach party to the Sea of Azov. I really honestly think that the NATO summit and then the talks in Saudi Arabia were all planned around this offensive being successful, and it just didn't happen. Vilnius was a complete wash because the Ukrainians got murdered in Zaporozhye in that first 2 weeks. They did absolutely nothing. They lost multiple Leopards, Bradleys, everything. It was horrible. And then, 3 months later, we're 8 kilometers further. I mean, it's just nothing went according to plan.
Yes. Which is a very good point. That's exactly what I suspected, and I've heard others mention this, and I agree with them. And so we're seeing these pro-Ukrainian commentators talking about how well they're doing against the Russians, but then you see things like this in the New York Times, which is obviously pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine, and they're citing a Ukrainian soldier, and he says Russians have more artillery, more tanks, more drones, and more people. And this is a veteran, an experienced Ukrainian Marine saying this to the New York Times. And they also fortify very well wherever they go, wherever they get to somewhere, be it a settlement, a forest belt, or just a field. So when you're on Twitter and you see videos of Russia destroying things, you see Ukraine destroying things, you cannot tell what is actually happening by just looking at these videos, especially when they're being cherry-picked by both sides. This is how you can tell where the balance lies in whose favor. This is a Ukrainian Marine. I guess he's a senior, probably NCO. He's saying that they're outnumbered, they're outgunned by the Russians. So if both sides are taking things out, at a minimum, Russia has more that they're able to lose, that they could afford to lose than Ukraine does. These are the little clues that you can find if you know nothing else about the conflict. These are the little clues that you can find that tells you how things are going.
It's like every single time these articles come out, like week by week, you have like 4 that get the memo. They all use the same picture. And then you have one outlier who actually says a little bit of truth, and it makes it look really bad. It's like, well, the Guardian's saying that the Ukrainians are winning and progressing and succeeding, and then New York Times is talking about this slug fest for villages of under 500 population. So it's just, it's very odd. It's there. I do believe that narrative is going to start crumbling extremely hard in the West when this offensive grinds to a halt, especially come the mud season. They won't be able to operate on anything other than the roads down in the south. So
and I'd like to ask you both a question, because I think we agree that the summit and then that meeting in Saudi Arabia, that was all predicated on the assumption that Ukraine would have done much, much better. But as we explained months before the offensive was even launched, that was never going to happen. It was obvious. It was so obvious. They did not have the means to overcome the defenses that Russia laid out. So why did they go through all the trouble to organize these events, humiliate themselves on the international stage, essentially? What made them think that this was going to turn out any better? We'll start with Scott, and then I want to hear Angelo as well.
I mean, they just were drinking their own Kool-Aid. That's the only thing I can see, because I'm an idiot. I'm not going to claim to be an expert. I follow this closely. I want to analyze it and study it, but I'm not a 5-star general. I'm not somebody who knows, grand battle, and I don't have all of the information. But I was looking at this, 5 months ago or 4 months ago, and I was going, I don't understand how this is going to happen. They've already delayed it. They're obviously having problems. They're going to force them to go. And I honestly, the way that they approached this whole offensive was the Russians are going to run away. That's what they've done. That's what they did in Kharkov. That's what they ended up doing in Kherson when their logistics got interrupted. And that's what they're going to do here. They're going to move away. I think that's why they blew the dam, was because they were expecting a much easier logistics line across the empty reservoir. They wanted to take back the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. They wanted to do all of these things in a very quick fashion because they assumed that the Russians would run away. And the Russians just said, no, we're going to fight in the security zone and you're not going to gain an inch. That they went in these columns, got stuck in minefields, and got obliterated. That was like the whole first 2 weeks of this offensive. And I think that came as a shock to a lot of people. And then, you saw 3-4 different, I guess what they would call strategy adjustments where they changed how they were going to fight. They went from the NATO idea back to the Ukrainian idea, back to a sort of NATO idea, and then back to a Ukrainian idea. They have like an identity crisis right now about how to fight, because half their army is NATO trained. But the thing about NATO training is it doesn't make sense. It's all it is but all it's ever been has been on a book, right? It's never actually been implemented against a near peer adversary. So, you're talking about, oh, well, the U.S. did this in Iraq. Why can't the Ukrainians do it here and stuff like that? And it's just like, it's apples and oranges. You're comparing two completely different scenarios, and the Russians are not the. I honestly think they just made the Russians out to be a complete joke in their mind. They didn't understand the idea of space for time that the Russians were going for up in the Kharkov region. They didn't understand the morale of the Russians. That I am in contact with people who are near to people on the front line, who have very accurate information regularly, who I trust as my sources, and they talk about how these guys are not, they're not living horrible lives. They have all the food they need. They have all the support they need. Every now and then you get issues with paychecks and stuff like that. You see these videos of these, units going on. And that's actually, I think that's a really good thing, is voicing these issues and then having them corrected. Obviously, any military, any government is going to have its corruption. It's going to have its holes. It's going to have its issues. But I think that the West really thought that the Russian military was in a very, very bad spot. And when they went and then they weren't, there was no backup plan. You don't see a backup plan. They're still slamming their heads into Rabitny, right? There has been no adjustment there. I think they're still looking for a breakthrough in this area, and it's the Russians are just not going to allow it to happen very easily. So.
And Angelo, what can you add to that? I agree, Scott. By the way, Angelo, why do you think they were so certain of all of these things, and they were so wrong? And I think Scott said it perfectly. They thought it was just going to be like they're going to be able to train Ukraine to fight like the Americans did in Desert Storm. Why did you think they thought that?
Well, it's I think part of it is arrogance. And then I think, where do those politicians take their information from? Is from analysts, and many of those analysts, they work from the military-industrial complex. What the military-industrial complex wants is to have a war that lasts a long time and sell weapons. And I think you see that arrogance is very interesting. If you look at the positions right now, Ukrainian army is actually exactly where the Russian army wanted them to be. The Russian army wanted to be on the defensive, have heavily fortified lines, and actually just waited for them to come. I think the most dramatic thing that could happen would be that not to have the Ukrainian on the offensive, because that would go against the plan of having this war of attrition. You need to let them coming, and they're doing exactly what the Russian forces want them to do. It's just wait and see, and they're like sitting duck. You behind your fortified lines, you have advantage, ammunitions, artillery, and so on. Just with them come, and they're doing exactly that. And the thing is that they don't learn. And also there's another problem, is that there's time pressure. As we said earlier, they need to keep this support, Western support, going, and the problem is that it's decreasing. We know that all around Europe, people are getting tired already. It's been 16, 17 months. People are getting tired. So Ukrainians have time constraint, and they have the pressure from NATO to have results. Russia doesn't have that time constraint, and we see this Russian economy is doing well. It can go on for 10 years. There's no problem. Ukraine, no way, and Europe. I mean, everybody's suffering. Europe, Ukraine, and in a lesser extent the US. So I see. So I would say it's a mix of ignorance and also the politicians. There's wishful thinking, and also they're listening to analysts that are actually not doing their real job. There's a mix. They don't know, should it be analysts or should it be propaganda agents? You either do one or the other. The problem is that they have mixed tasks. So when you are doing analysis and propaganda agent, you're actually it's going against the interest of the collective West, because if politicians really knew what was going on the field, then it would be different. And again, remember Trump. I remember Trump, that actually Trump was saying that he was taking intelligence from Fox News. He was not listening to the CIA, and so he was taking the information from Fox News. So imagine how many liars. It's just absurd. So I think, and that's probably the reality when it comes to those EU and US politicians.
Yeah, I just want to show. Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
And the intelligence community. I mean, the reason why this is continuing is just like how blatantly these people lie to the people in charge. They know what's going on, but they want this to continue. So,
Angelo was talking about these analysts, and one of them who I've been listening to since the very beginning of the special military operation is Michael Kaufman. I believe he was actually born in Ukraine. He just recently moved over to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which does the exact opposite of what its name suggests. It is a U.S. government and arms industry funded think tank. And right down here, it says he regularly advises senior government and military officials. He was one of the many who was utterly convinced that you could just build NATO-style brigades out of thin air and send them at the Russians and rout Russian troops. And he was completely shocked by how this offensive turned out. So, and he's advising people in the government and in the U.S. military. He has no military background either, by the way, which you don't necessarily need to have, but it helps. And I think a lot of the things that he got wrong, especially about how long it takes to train and the nature, how complicated and difficult logistics are. He got a lot of that wrong because he didn't study that specifically, and he had no experience to draw from. So I think I agree with both you, Scott, and Angelo about why they completely got this wrong, and it's turning out catastrophically for Ukraine. Do we have anything else we want to talk about Ukraine before? Scott, looks like you have something you'd like to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to this and what Angelo was saying about the analysts. And the crazy thing is they haven't changed their tune. They're still pushing the same thing, which is, extremely negative for Ukraine in terms of its longevity in this conflict. If you want Ukraine to continue fighting, pretending like this offensive is going good will, in the short term, perhaps keep support coming. But as soon as the reality hits, and the reality always is going to hit, right? That support is going to drop off even harder because now you've been lied to and the results aren't there. So it's very interesting to me. I always say, like, if you want Ukraine to continue fighting longer, go on the defensive. Don't force the Russians to do what you're forcing the Ukrainians to do. Make it so costly for the Russians everywhere that it starts to domestically affect the situation. Put pressure on Putin in that way. I don't think that can happen at this point. But exactly what the Russians want is how the Ukrainians should have been fighting it. It should have been a Vietnam-style war where you're degrading the Russians and you're just making life hell all over the place for these mobilized men. But instead, these guys are sitting in trenches, which is not uncomfortable. If you've seen any of these Russian trenches, they have underground facilities, beds, everything. They're not standing in mud. The situation is not bad for them. And they have these Ukrainians marching across open fields, which is what the Russians should be doing against the Ukrainians if the Ukrainians wanted to actually have some chance at long-term success in this conflict. They're just burning the candle at both ends, basically, with what they're doing.
And don't you both think that it's ironic that the West for many, many months said that Russian President Vladimir Putin was delusional? He surrounded himself with people who weren't telling him anything about reality. It turns out that it was the West that was actually doing that. One last thing I forgot to point out. Another thing that the pro-Ukrainian commentators are completely focused on are these drone strikes. Now, Scott, you mentioned a little bit about this. Are these drone strikes, they're becoming more frequent? It's hard to tell whether they saved up for this and this is something they plan to coincide with the offensive, or they've actually built up their capacity to move this many drones on a regular basis. What kind of impact is this going to have on the outcome of the fighting, Russian society, the psychology of the Russian people, and so on?
Well, I mean, in my personal opinion, domestically, this supports Putin, right? This just strengthens his position. Internationally, I think it does as well outside of the collective West. You're seeing Ukraine act out the exact stereotype, basically, that Putin had presented. We have this semi-terrorist state with Nazi ideologies who are, fundamentally against the Russian people in Ukraine and the Russian people inside of Russia. Also, the way the West approached this with the immense amount of Russophobia, the best thing that the West could have done would have been saying, hey, everybody, leave Russia, come over here. We're going to give you everything you could never have in Russia, whatever that means, and really pull that group away, because I bet there are a good percentage of Russian, liberals, however you want to describe it. A lot of the people that left at the beginning who ended up staying in the country, and they were like, wow, Putin was right. These people hate us. They're not sanctioning Putin. They're not sanctioning the Russian government. They're sanctioning me, us. They're trying to make my life difficult. They don't care about Russians. They don't care about, freedom or democracy. What they care about is pushing their agenda. And I think that has really strengthened and solidified Putin's position inside of Russia with the actual population of Russia. And long story short, these drones just are an extension of that. These drone strikes, most of them are not hitting military targets. Every day you see drones heading towards Moscow and heading towards these random civilian areas. You're still seeing the shelling of Donetsk continue. None of this is going to actually benefit Ukraine, other than keeping them in the headlines and boosting morale within the country, which is a continuation of what we just talked about with the analysts, where people think things are going good because things are on fire inside of Russia. What they don't understand is Russia is a huge country. And, during World War II, they moved all of their production to the east of the country. This is something that people don't understand, is that a fire in Moscow, a fire in Rostov, a fire in Crimea is not going to actually change the war. All it is going to do is help your perception of the war. And that's what Ukraine does best, is perception manipulation. They do it like no country I've ever seen. We have had the last 3 strike days from Russia, missile strikes and drone strikes, and we've seen almost no explosions. The only explosion, or the only hit we've seen, was in Kiev, and it was presented by The Guardian. And that's a mistake. That's a mistake that The Guardian made in their narrative, and it's just, they have this immense narrative control, and it's going to come to an end. And really, these drone strikes are just continuing the burning the candle at both ends. Like I said earlier, it's a morale boost that doesn't really affect anything. Just like hitting the Crimean Bridge. They just tried to hit the Crimean Bridge yesterday or the day before again with surface drones. This time they were stopped because the Russians have actually put up defenses now around the bridge. And even if you hit the bridge is there is a land bridge that runs to Crimea. That was the whole purpose of that southern invasion, and why there was so much focus on Kiev, when in the south, that was the actual success, was surrounding Mariupol and creating that land bridge. They can utilize that for logistics now. You don't need the Kerch Bridge, right? That's a weak point that was eliminated. These drone strikes are, rather meaningless in the long run. Any of these losses will be replaced eventually. And it really just boosts Putin's image. I think that, Africa is now handily heading towards Russia and China. And you're seeing, Saudi Arabia, their whole, that whole summit just collapsed. Saudi Arabia is now a part of BRICS. So that's a big change. BRICS is expanding. Russia is going slow in Ukraine, but I think geopolitically is winning almost everywhere.
I think that is a very good point, especially about the drones. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Angelo? Because Scott actually set up the transition to talk about Niger and
Oh,
the
we
rest
can
of
switch.
Africa pretty well.
We can switch to Nigeria. I think it's a very interesting topic, and I think that we need to remember that what is happening in Ukraine is a micro event. It's the BRICS, what is happening with BRICS in Africa, this multipolar world, and de-dollarization. Those are the big events. That is the trigger. Actually, if you look at Ukraine, that is the trigger that actually emboldened many other countries. Because just think about how many countries actually are going through a clearing system which is going to bypass the US dollar. Gaddafi got caught for this. Saddam Hussein got killed for this too. There was not a single country that actually dared to challenge the US dollar hegemony. Now you have overnight 80% of the world that says, you know what, we don't need the US dollar. It was unthinkable that you had, like, the Kenyan president, he said in front of all the other African presidents, he said, why do we need the dollar? Why can't we trade in our own currencies? But you know what? Before this war in Ukraine, there was not a single country that would actually dare to do that. Now they realize we have, NATO is not, the strongest force. This Russia has our back. I think this is because Russia is standing up, but not only for Russia, it's standing up for the non-aligned world, the global south, and that's the major thing. So Russia, the single event of Ukraine, that's a small thing. It's important to always look at the big picture. That's a small event, but that is the trigger. Because of that, we're entering into a new paradigm where you have those countries in Africa. They say, well, you know what? Stop with that. Why should I actually keep on using a French printed currency and use it in my country? Where's my sovereignty? Now it's going to be the real decolonization, not the this war of independence where you actually still, it's just cosmetic. Now they're going towards that way, and they are going to have ripple effect, because other countries, this is the beginning, other countries will follow. And I don't know if you saw a Cameroon president, he actually fired lots of military officials just because they're getting scared. Those are big signs.
So we're looking at a map of ECOWAS. It's a collection. It's supposed to be an economic union in West Africa. We have Niger here. I'm going to admit that I'm not an expert on Africa. I focus on Eurasia, which is a pretty big place. Is hard. When something happens in a place like Niger, people ask me, Brian, why haven't you covered it yet? Because in order to cover it properly, you have to do a lot of research. So I am doing a lot of research. I'm starting, and I want to hear everyone else's take on what happened. I'm looking right now militarily at Niger and its allies, which you can see here in red, and then the rest of ECOWAS in gray. These are the nations that might be poised for an intervention. Looking at all of these militaries, none of them have a very large, powerful military, although Nigeria has a much larger military than Niger and all of their allies combined. The deciding factor, I think, and I'd like to hear our others' opinion on this, would be if France decides to intervene, at least lend its air power, perhaps station some of its warplanes in one of these ECOWAS nations involved in the intervention, and it will end up looking a lot like Libya did, where NATO did not go in on the ground. Maybe they had some special forces, but what they did was send arms, and they provided air cover, and that was enough to destroy the Libyan military, destroy and destabilize the country to this day. As a matter of fact, Libya is right there. And if you're wondering where all these terrorists, by the way, that all of these countries are collectively always fighting against, in addition to now this conflict, they all got their weapons from NATO flooding Libya with weapons, and they were arming extremists, and those extremists are connected to the networks everywhere else across North and West Africa. So maybe, Scott, what have you been tracking in regards to Niger, the possible intervention? What do you think France's role might be? And then Angelo, who speaks French and follows the French-speaking media. Scott, what do you think?
So let me just preface this by saying I'm no expert, both culturally and geographically in this area, but I have been doing some reading on it. And from what I've picked up, what you just said, the terrorists that they're always fighting, a lot of these coups seem to be like popular support for a stronger military to deal with an insurrection of a certain population. I think that they are regulated to Muslim, but I don't actually think it's a Muslim issue. It's a long-standing ethnic issue in the region. And that's where a lot of this fighting in Niger and Mali comes from. In terms of the actual intervention, the longer this goes, the less likely I see an intervention actually occurring. It seems like the junta in Niger is now very established. They're talking about transitions and all sorts of different things like that. And you're also seeing a lot of these popular coups happening in other places. We just saw one in, is it Gabon? Is that how it's pronounced? Yeah, which is another French colony. So the French are really starting to lose a grip in this region. I think an intervention would only hasten that situation because countries are not going to want to get involved in that. And I don't think anybody really wants to see a war in Africa right now, especially West Africa. But if an intervention does happen, I like I said, I don't know enough about the area to actually know how it goes, but I would be very, very cautious if I was France in their approach to this, because I think it could go horribly for them. Like we've seen their Africa, their whole Africa situation deteriorate over the last year or so.
Angelo, what's your take? And you were telling me that you were following the French-speaking media from these nations that were colonized by France.
Yeah, we need to be extremely careful. Some revolutionary movements, some are actually reactionary movements. So when it comes to, for example, we saw Niger. Niger is clearly a movement for emancipation, for self-determination of Niger. Niger is very strategically located. There's a pipeline. There's also uranium that actually France has been buying from Niger for a long time. They've been buying for very cheaply, so they've been actually looting the whole country for a long time. But then when it comes to, and so it was actually they've been threatening to have some military intervention through ECOWAS. This is a supranational institution, which is actually controlled by the West, kind of controlled by the West through Nigeria. But then we see there's a different treatment of information when it comes to Gabon. And in reality, in Gabon, what happened is that Ali Bongo, he was supposed to lose the election, but the election were rigged. And somehow 2 days before the result of the elections, they actually stopped foreign media, especially French media. They banned them. So basically, there was already a tension between the French, probably the DGSA, which is the secret services of France. There were already some tensions. So what happens that normally this election should have gone to another opponent, and there was a coup in between. And the coup was instigated by people from the clan of the Ali Bongo. This general is actually cousin of Ali Bongo. So what happens is what we call a revolution palace, a palace revolution. So basically, this is the same clan which is actually doing a coup. But in reality, ultimately, they took the power. But in reality, the real news is actually the rigged election. Because now you end up with, from one puppet to another, probably still controlled by France. And there was probably a tacit agreement between them that France was going to be passive and don't do anything. But in reality, the real news is the rigged election. So we need to be extremely careful. Even though there's a movement, Pan-Africanism movement in the region of emancipation, we need to be really careful not to jump to conclusion. A lot of people, they were doing wishful thinking when it comes to Gabon, because there was this dictator, corrupt dictator, is a billionaire. He's been in power for 50 years. He was clearly a French puppet. And because of that, they're very happy. There's oversimplification. They say, well, he's gone, There was a French puppet. That means,
Good.
that's good. That's good for the country and so on. That's oversimplification. What happens is that I think that nothing will change, and I think people should focus on one thing. And we talk about this over and over and over. Sovereignty. We need to ask the question: is this country sovereign state? Yes or no? And again, when you have army troops on your soil, you don't control your economy, and you have France which is still printing your own currency. Well, you know what? It doesn't matter who you're electing. You need to gain your sovereignty. And this is what this Pan-Africanist movement is doing. And ultimately, well, they need to get all the troops, those French troops, out and print their own currency and have, self-determination. So we need to be extremely careful. And there's also another thing which is really important for those the whole region is this jihadi movements. Those jihadist movements were actually, supplied, their army arms were supplied by NATO, by the West. And the French troops have been justifying their presence in the region because of fighting the jihadists. We've seen that before, right? Remember, in Syria, it's a convenient enemy. And in reality, it's been the operation is called Opération Barkhane. It's been 8 years that the French troops are in the region to fight the jihadists. For 8 years, there was not a single fight between the jihadists and the French troops. We've seen that before, right?
Yes.
So it's a convenient enemy. And I want to add one more thing. Last thing is it's what I shared with you, Brian, before. There's a system of lending money to those African countries and in the developing world as well. They have preconditions, and one of the preconditions is that you need to keep your defense spending very low. So when you look at the defense spending of most of those countries in Africa, it's under 1%. So already the GDP is very low. But then when you take the percent of defense within that GDP, it's even lower. Just to compare, the NATO requirement spending is 2%. Those countries is 1%. So in reality, they cannot defend themselves. You need to keep their army weak. So if they don't go along with your policies, with your globalist agenda, well, they're easy target. You can topple the government easily because they have no defense.
That's a really good point, Angelo. And I was as I looked at the military capabilities of each of these ECOWAS countries, I noticed that the only modern weaponry that they had among them was from China. And that's another thing. People have to be very careful. Just like you said, Angelo, you see a coup. It seems like a French ally has been deposed, but you really do have to dig very deep into all of it. I face the same problem here in Thailand, trying to explain to people what's happening. A lot of people say the Thai military or monarchy as being a very pro-U.S. ally, but in reality, that isn't the case. It wasn't even the case when they were hosting U.S. troops during the Vietnam War. So it's much more complicated. People have to clear the table of ideology and superficiality and really dig into what is going on. Follow the money, follow the interests and associations. It would be interesting to see these countries that are being armed by China, but they're still doing the bidding of France. This shows how complicated this transition from unipolarism to multipolarism can get. So we have to be on the lookout for that. Scott, I wanted to ask you about Wagner. I don't know how closely you've been following Wagner's activity in Africa. Prigozhin is deceased from after the plane crash.
Yeah.
What impact is this going to have on Wagner, and what is Wagner's role in all of this, especially Niger?
So, from what it sounds like from the Wagner associated sources that I follow, it seems like operations in Africa are going to continue. They had a chain of command in order in case some of these guys died. They were always on the front line, so this is not something completely unexpected. It is a major loss, obviously, for the organization. We don't know who's heading it now. We don't know if it's going to continue to be Wagner. These private military contractors, companies will just switch their name, but all of the guys, all of the material are rotated over into this new group. So, it might not be Wagner in the future. It might be something else. It could be Wagner just because of how much name recognition that has and what it's done. Time will tell. The plane only went down, a week ago? Something like that. So it has not been an extended period of time. The bodies just got put into the ground. So in terms of what's going to happen with the Wagner organization, we'll see. We've seen some suspicious layoffs in the Russian military, which gives me the impression that these guys might be going somewhere, whether that's a new grouping, whether that is inside of Wagner, so the MOD has more control over the organization. Who knows? Time will tell. But I don't think Wagner is going to go anywhere. They're not going to leave Africa. That is vital to Russian interests in the continent. So I don't think Wagner is going to move out of there, whether they're called Wagner or called something else. We'll see in the future.
Yes, and Wagner, I do believe, was involved in the fighting, may still be involved in the fighting in Libya, which is still ongoing. I have not been following that because obviously I'm concentrating on other areas, but I think in order to get some insight into what might happen in Niger, look at the fighting in Libya and the role Wagner has played and what that might lend in terms of capabilities to Niger, who will need it. They have nothing in terms of tanks or artillery. They have no air force. It really will be an irregular army going up against a somewhat well-equipped army led by Nigeria. So here's a question, and I saw another question about is the United States happy that France is having all these problems in Africa? And I just want to remind people that AFRICOM, U.S. Military command over the entire continent of Africa, but the U.S. isn't an empire or anything. They are working together in tandem with France. They work together in Libya. They work together in Syria, and they most certainly are working together in Niger and the adjacent nations. What the United States likes to do is use another nation like France or like Germany or like the UK as a proxy, because if the US is everywhere, it just makes it that much easier for people to oppose the US and their agenda. If they spread it out, if this is a French agenda here, an American agenda there, British agenda over there, it becomes more complicated. And you see how people struggle to understand these things. They're not easy things to understand. So I just wondered, Scott, and then Angelo, what your thoughts were on that. Is America happy or helping?
I'll defer to Angelo because he's definitely much more knowledgeable on this subject, and then I'll add some nonsense in after he's done.
I think this is a very interesting question, actually. The US has created some ports around the world to create regions, to control some regions. And I think we can, if I was to say South America, I think what stands out is Colombia. We saw Colombia actually working as a proxy for the US, and especially when it was, they wanted to topple the Venezuela government. So they use, they're trying to create some ports, right? In Israel is actually, they're using Israel as a platform in the Middle East. Ukraine is the same, is how you can, in that region, how you can have actually the Israel of the Eastern Europe. Now you have Japan, the same. How can we actually hijack Japan? They've been hijacking Japan since World War II. You have army bases there. It's a occupied country. So you see, they have their agent. And when it comes to Africa, they're using France as their agent in Africa because, they cannot be everywhere. And they're sharing, a sphere of influence. Vietnam was the same, actually. Vietnam, do you remember? It was actually a sharing between a transition between France. They handed over to the US. The French, they were like, we can't do it, and we can't deal with that anymore. And the US took over. So you see, that's how they do, and they're trying to do the same actually with Australia. So I think the US has limited capabilities, and they're willing to fund but on the ground, and sometimes it's optics too. optics, and it was convenient. It was convenient for the US to have French speakers too. Somehow to have the French to do the dirty work on the ground.
Do you, Angela, what do you put the possibility of intervention occurring in Niger?
I think it's low. The more times goes on,
Yeah.
the lower it gets. But what surprises me is really how naive was ECOWAS. Just think about in terms of face. If you are talking in terms of pressure and strategy, you increase. Pressure should be incremental. What ECOWAS did right away, they said we are going to invade and so on, and then they're losing face now. Now they're backtracking. Actually, the latest I've seen was that they are actually putting pressure on Nigeria to have that government of transition to be not too long. So basically 9 months, and they would under 9 months they will have a transition to civilian government. And I think when it comes to Nigeria, what the military, if they want to do the right job, Nigeria army, what they should do is actually kick out all foreign influence. That's the first thing. If you want to have really election and hand over the power to the people, you need to kick out all the foreign interference, NGOs, whatever, if Soros is there, NED, and army troops. And then we can talk about elections.
They gave France until the 3rd to get out, right? Their military.
Yeah, there's officially, but there's an agreement. I think probably I don't know. It's negotiable. The ultimatum is negotiable, but I think there's a full agreement, and then there's what they want. Somehow they left to do some kind of midway, and keep in mind they need to make sure that French need to save face there. France is losing face so much in the whole region. You cannot kick out France like this, and France has interest. I think they need to be. Nigeria needs to be smart. They need to give an exit strategy to France, and so again, France is buying a lot of uranium. They're dependent on Nigeria uranium, and army troops are actually there to protect mainly French business interest. That's why they're there.
Yeah.
So it's one thing you say 48 hours or whatever, but I think they'll need to be more pragmatic. Give them an exit strategy and let them save face.
Yes, I agree with that. But so we'll just have to wait and see how that turns out. Anyone have anything else to add on this? Are we okay on time? Are you guys okay for?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, because the other issue is U.S.-Chinese tensions, and when you really zoom out and you look at this, Ukraine, Niger, the situation over Taiwan, this is all connected. This is the U.S. clinging to global hegemony and multipolarism, trying to displace it and overwrite it, essentially. So recent events regarding Taiwan, the U.S. is sending more military aid to Taiwan. I believe, I think it's the British foreign minister said something about Taiwan being an independent country, which it is not under according to the UN. It is an island province of China. According to the One China policy of virtually every nation on Earth, it is an island province of China. Even according to Taiwan's, the Republic of China's constitution is an island province of China. So where do we see any of this go? What have you been tracking, Scott, in terms of U.S.-Chinese tensions lately?
Just so where I've been focusing actually is domestically in the U.S. I've been following a lot of the expansion going on with Intel, which is chip manufacturing, semiconductors, and so on. There have been massive orders placed, and Intel is expanding exponentially. I have an Intel plant semi close to where I live, and it has been under construction for the last 2 years. There's about 9 cranes working 24/7, expanding, and just, really, really, there hasn't been any expansion like this in 20 years here. And now all of a sudden it's just exploding out of nowhere. And this is not relegated to where I live. This is also happening in Seattle and in other areas where Intel has operations. So It definitely looks like the U.S. is preparing for some sort of interruption in this region, whether that's kinetic or trade related. I'll be interested to see, but they're definitely preparing backup plans. In terms of the actual situation, I'm a little bit removed from the Taiwan Chinese issue just because I focus primarily on Ukraine. Angelo, if you have something to add to this, I'll be more than happy to listen. And I'll probably have something to add, but I would like the people who are actually focusing on this to really communicate it.
And for those who don't know, Angelo is actually living in China, so that helps quite a bit. And I just want to throw this up before you get started, Angelo. The U.S. Says they want to make a civilian port in these northernmost Philippine islands, less than 200 kilometers from the island of Taiwan. Angelo.
It's very sad. Actually, I used to live in Taiwan, so I used to live there like 30 years ago, and then the last 28 years in mainland China. What actually, there's so many similarities when you look at Taiwan and when you look at Ukraine. When you look at Taiwan, there's probably 90% of people that wants the status quo. Within the status quo, some want independence, some not, but they're very rational. They know that going for independence, like quickly for independence, would mean war with the mainland, and they all define themselves as Chinese still, And the constitution says clearly, we are part of China. So so that is for the people. But we saw that in Ukraine the same. Zelensky was elected on a platform of peace, making peace with Russia. So 73% of the people, they voted for Zelensky because they wanted peace. Now, did Zelensky follow the people? He didn't. And I think that is the same with Tsai Ing-wen. Tsai Ing-wen, we covered this with you, Brian. Tsai Ing-wen has been an agent, U.S. agent, since 2004, 2005. There are lots of cables in WikiLeaks that was exposed by WikiLeaks that actually was having secret meetings with the U.S. De facto embassy in Taiwan, which is the AIT, the American Institute in Taiwan. And she was actually reporting to them since then. So she's been pre-selected. You see, that's the system that we have in the West. In the West, not the president, but all the candidates are always pre-selected by, those institutes. It could be Bilderberg, it could be World Economic Forum, or it could be the U.S. Embassy in the case of Taiwan. So she was pre-selected. They groomed her, and she was actually, before being elected, she was on all the magazines, Times Magazine, everywhere, because they built that image of the new democracy in Taiwan, which was a young democracy, by the way, very young democracy. So again, we have a U.S. agent which is in Taiwan, which is not working for the interest of Taiwanese, but she's working for the interest of the U.S. and the globalist agenda. So sadly, what I fear is that the democracy in Taiwan has been hijacked. Hijacked, why? Because you have all those NGOs, you have all those groups, all those politicians that have been co-opted by the West. And they're not working for the interest of Taiwanese, they're working for the West. And we've seen that over and over. So, they're claiming they want sovereignty. They don't, decisions are right now. I don't know what's the level of, the decisions, if they're free to have some margins of decisions. But we see it now, right now in Ukraine, who are taking these decisions. I wouldn't be surprised at the CIA. It's all in the hands of the CIA. And Taiwan, not that bad, but it's not looking good, really. And this is completely disconnected. When you look at the people in power and the people in the street, they don't want that. They're all against that system. But you know what? The democratic system they have installed in Taiwan is controlled by some elites, and they are going to make sure that whoever wins is going to go along with the U.S. agenda.
Yes, and I put this up on the screen. Taiwan is, I'm not sure about 1,000% depending on China, but it is significantly dependent on the rest of China economically. And they're going to do the exact same thing we saw Ukraine do. The US installed a client regime in Ukraine, and what it did was irrationally cut ties with Russia, who it did a lot of economic and industrial business with. Everything imploded. Everything, and then you see the conflict follow, and Ukraine is being utterly destroyed, physically, economically, politically. The exact same thing is going to happen at Taiwan if they go down this route. So we have to keep a close eye on Taiwan, Niger, as well as Ukraine. A lot of people are laser focused on Ukraine, but it is one part of a much larger conflict, I guess you could call it, or contest, geopolitical contest. Scott, do you have anything you wanted to add on to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the rhetoric around China has not abated even a little bit. You know, the current administration is talking about arming Taiwan, and all of the political candidates from both sides have, even the ones that are talking about, you know, a settlement in Ukraine, peace with Russia, like Vivek, he's one of the most outspoken, and he's still drumming up this Taiwan is our next big enemy. You know, we need to pull Russia away from China, which is actually a smart strategy. I think it's too late for that strategy, but you know, we got to pull Russia back into our sphere of influence, release the sanctions so we can focus solely on an isolated China. And I just, you know, this is just something that it's never going to go away. And I have not seen the appetite for this change at all through this Russia conflict, which you think it would have, but you know, it hasn't. So yeah.
And do we think that Russia is going to, even for a moment, not realize that being lured over by the West against China so they could destroy China, that they're not going to then go back to Russia and wipe out Russia? I mean, again, it goes back to, why did they actually think the Ukrainian offensive was going to succeed? Why do they think that this strategy of dividing Russia from China is going to succeed? Who in Russia is going to go for this? Does anybody want to venture a guess?
It's I think it's just a feedback loop. You have your intel community telling the politicians that this can work. This is going to work. This strategy is going to work. You have the politicians regurgitating that to the media, and then the media is, you know, conveying that to the public. So it's this incestuous situation in the U.S. where no proper intel is actually reaching the higher echelons, and money is king. So whatever is going to boost the industrial, you know, military industrial complex. You know, if production of F-35s is increasing, every congressional district wins, right? You're creating jobs. It's just never going to go away as long as people are making money. And you know, that's an unfortunate truth of the situation.
Even if it's in a way that ultimately is unsustainable, I think that's important to add, because yes, the military industrial complex is making a lot of money, but their military industrial output is inadequate for these wars that they are pushing these think tanks to drum up. So it is very bizarre the way that this is all.
See, you're getting lost in the minutia of things. You're actually paying attention, and you know what's going on. The politicians don't look at industrial output. You know, that's one thing that I always have to remind myself constantly. And I don't mean this as an insult to people who are on the spectrum, but we are sort of autistic about this conflict. We hyper focus and not just this conflict, but geopolitics in general. If you talk to anybody in America, I talk to people all day, they have no idea what's going on in Ukraine. They don't even know what our government is doing for Ukraine. They will randomly catch a headline that the Biden administration is giving $1.2 billion to Ukraine in weapons or something like that. And, you know, the reaction is either, yeah, I support Ukraine because I don't know anything about it, or, you know, screw Joe Biden because I don't like Joe Biden. And then it's in one ear, out the other, right? It just doesn't stick around. I talk to people all the time about this. People ask, oh, what do you do? Like, what is your podcast about? I'm like, oh, the Russia-Ukraine war, and they're like, that's still going on. People just don't know. They don't have time. They don't care. So you have to also take that into consideration when you're talking about these things. Is most of the people in the chat who actually are interested here listening to it, they know. They're all talking to people who also know, and then we know, and we're talking about it. But outside of the information space, people don't know what's going on at all. And that's why I push so hard to, expand the audience that we have, because this information is vital. It's so important to American interests, French interests of the people of these countries, German interests, Ukrainian interests, and it just doesn't get out because it's not in mainstream media, and people don't have the time to pay attention to it. So,
yeah, absolutely.
I think it's a big topic here. I think what the Chinese say. They're saying know yourself and know your enemy. And I think we need to really look at our own society. The problems comes already from our own society. I would say people they don't even know their own society, the whole political system, how it works, even the fundamentals of what is democracy, what is sovereignty. Even they have empty slogans or constitution, but people don't even know what is in the constitution, so they don't know their own system. The system they have inside, let's say in the US, it's a divide and control system, and because they need to have the 99% of people to be divided, because so they don't see that the real enemy is the 1%, and then they want to go all the way to China, and actually they don't know anything about that, and they want to export a system which is not working, by the way, at home, and they want to export it there because we have the values and so on. That's the whole American exceptionalism that they want to export, and it's not working, and people know it, And on the other side, from the Chinese side, then you have this pool of knowledge. It is shocking. It's so humbling. That's my whole experience about China. That I want to tell people. I came to China the same as the average Joe. The things he knows, I've been brainwashed by Hollywood. I arrived to China and just realized I know nothing. I need to start listening. And, after 30 years, you become humble. And Chinese, they know so much about their own history. And guess what? They know everything about what is happening in the US. They know everything. So that's the problem we have. We don't know ourselves, and we don't even have a single, the simplest idea, about what is happening in China. They know that, and knowing their history too. You see, kids, we learn history
anywhere for that matter. It's not just China, it's Russia. Even somebody like me who has focused on Russia for the past 10 years, I learn stuff every day about the people, about the culture, about the way they approach things. And it's completely different than a Western perspective. And you're trying to force your ideologies on these people that are just completely different and more knowledgeable than yourself. From an American perspective, at least.
It's got a lot to do with education too. Go ahead, Angelo.
Yeah, I want to add it. So, just... you see, we are going through a crazy time in the West. This whole project of deconstructing human being. Social. It's social engineering. People. They don't know what. They want to change sex. All those issues. Hysterical climate issues, and so. It's like a cult. Those are cults, but it's a system of deconstruction. You see, so you basically you deconstruct your family, your religion, the sense of belonging, all those very strong values. Now, when you look at what is the strength of Russia and China and why they are going to fight for that, because once you have strong values, it's a values of belonging. You believe in family. It's strong. You know what? It's a father, mother. We have a family, and you construct something. You believe in your religion. Faith. When you have faith, how strong you are. I'm not saying that I respect, I'm not for religions, but when you know that, and you have a sense of history and so on, well, guess what? You have Russians, they know about their history, what they've gone through World War II, they love their country, sense of family and so on. That's why you have those guys in the trenches. Now, look in the West. Do you think those liberals are going to go into the trenches and fight for? No, it's those, but because we made them like this, the system made them like this. You need to have slave labor in a survival mode, give them drugs, alcohol, and porn, and just deconstruct them, and that's it. You can mold them. And this is why the West cannot fight the war that Russia and China is willing to fight.
And just when we're talking about education, I mean, it's incredible how far the U.S. is now lagging behind. I mean, it's really good to have very ignorant individuals coming into the world, into the workforce, who aren't paying attention to anything. They're very distracted by everything, and it allows the elites to do whatever they want. But I always find it extremely interesting because the U.S. history, the U.S. history we study, it goes from the founding fathers, 1776, to World War I. And you don't do anything after World War I. And that's the part of U.S. history that's most applicable to the people in the United States. We don't talk about Korea. We don't talk about Vietnam. We don't talk about Iraq, Afghanistan, any of this, any of the things that we've done that have not benefited the United States, have not benefited the world. We never communicate them to kids. Kids don't know about the Korean War. Most kids don't even know about the Vietnam War outside of pop culture references. Good Morning Vietnam is like about as far as most people get. And it's just, the U.S. is going to lose in the long run because its people are not united. Its people are not a people even, there's no American identity anymore. There is a Russian identity. There is a Chinese identity, and these things that people are willing to die for. And I just don't see that in the U.S. at all. Where we have our own individual identities, which is fantastic, but it doesn't make for a very strong nation when things get going in the wrong direction.
Yes, agreed. I think. Well, let's see. Is there any? Can we do some questions? Are we okay to do some questions?
Sure.
All right. If you have a question, just all caps or a capital Q, and then write your question. I think those were all really good points, and I think looking at any one of these conflicts, we cannot just focus on what's happening on the battlefield. We have to look at what is happening behind it. We talked about military and industrial output in general. Education is something that is a foundation for what a nation is capable or incapable of doing. So when you start looking to all these things, which might not be as interesting as looking into weapon systems and watching videos of armed conflict, but this is what's actually going to explain what is going to happen and to whose advantage things will lean. Let's see if we got any questions.
Can I add one thing, Brian?
Go ahead. Yes.
There's one thing that I like to repeat, during those shows is that people that don't know us, they might think, oh, you are anti-US, you're anti-West, you're pro-Russian, pro-Chinese. Yep. Actually, it's not true. It is not true. Actually, it's out of love for my country, because I don't like my country to act stupid and it's going to hit the wall. I want my country to be inspired by best practice, good thing. This is what Chinese did, actually. Their political system, they went around the world and they were looking at, let's be humble. Let's learn from what is the best practice. I see systems that are delivering, people happy, prosperity. I see it. I've seen it over the last 30 years in China. And I'm like, why do you want to fight that? We have so many problems there. And it's out of ignorance. So I want to repeat, this is, it's the same as, when you care about your family, you are going to tell inconvenient truth. Let's say your sister, she's doing something wrong. If you love your sister, you're going to tell her. So I think we love more our country than most people that are pro-US or pro-West. Because you know what? If they were honest and if they really love their country, they would actually point out what the country is doing wrong. And you know what? Why not we solve our problems back home first before trying to export things that it's nonsense and it's leading us towards war.
Yes,
Yeah.
and wars you can't win because of the problems you have back at home that you refuse to solve,
Absolutely.
Scott.
See, Angelo is just an older, smarter, better-looking version of myself. I follow that exact.
You know what? I just got my. I was watching it, the three of us, just like now relax a bit. But we just have the same haircut. I was like, wow,
But yeah, the idea that I in my information space, I post a lot of the Ukrainian failures, and because I think it's so fundamentally void in the information space. I'm one of few. I mean, I can probably count them on my hand of big accounts that actually expose the failures of Ukraine instead of just showing a very pro-Ukrainian outlook on the situation. And the reason why I do that, and I get called a Kremlin shill, all of this, as soon as the Kremlin wants to start paying me, hey, give me a call, I'm on board. But until that time, the information that I put out is because nobody else is talking about this.
Yeah.
Literally, I feel like it's my civic duty to show people what is actually happening in these countries. In Africa, in the Middle East, and especially in Ukraine, because it's so it's at the center of all of this, and just Americans don't know. Most English speaking audiences don't know. It's such a niche group that actually presents this information. So call me whatever you want, but what I want is I want the US to get its I don't want to say ass kicked, because I don't mean it in like an actual the U.S. is losing. I want the U.S. to get a wake-up call. I want this Ukraine situation to end poorly so that, the American population goes, well, what the hell are we doing? Like a Vietnam wake-up where, everybody starts protesting and they're like, how about we fix the issues at home before we're going abroad and trying to fix issues that we're creating? Like you guys said, we have so many issues domestically. We have crumbling infrastructure. We have, immigration issues. However you want to look at it, if you want people to come in, allow people to come in legally and start paying taxes. That's not what's going on, right? So, and I don't really focus on any of that stuff, but we have all of these issues in the United States that we're not dealing with at all. They're continuing to be neglected and get worse. Education is horrible. I mean, absolutely disastrous right now. There are kids in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade in middle school who went through their years in, their elementary school years in COVID. These kids can't read. They can't multiply. I mean, the education system is so degraded and so full of bureaucracy and is so afraid of getting sued that it can't even, produce knowledgeable individuals. Maybe that's part of the plan. Maybe you don't want knowledgeable individuals because then they create problems. But the education is so poor in the US, and the actual global knowledge that Americans have is so minute that we got to focus on these issues. And I'm trying to always present these issues to an audience that's willing to listen, because if I'm not doing it, I mean, there's like 4 other people, Brian, Angelo, and the Duran, but in terms of the actual English, I don't want to call it pro-Russian because I don't see myself necessarily as pro-Russian. I'm pro-US, and I want the US to do better. But there's nobody showing the actual reality, and so that's what I try to do through my messaging.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just a little bit outside the topic, but there's this song which I was very touching. Oliver Anthony. Did you hear that song? And it was very interesting for maybe 10 days after that song. It was a very deep song, a very meaningful song, and you had this realization that actually everybody was coming together. But it didn't last much, but it was extremely interesting on just telling the reality of average Joe, what average Joe is going through, the difficulties and so on, and the fact that we are not, in the US, they're not focusing on their own problem inside, And I think it comes down to everything. It comes down to solving the problems inside the country, no matter what, and just trying to, unite people. And because the problem we have in the West is that the concept of democracy is the what we call the mob rule. We end up with the 51%, which is going to work for their own interest against the 49%. And you see in China, the approach in China is actually consensus. It's not because I get the majority, I get elected, that I'm going to follow. I'm going to look at the whole pool. I'm going to work for the 100%. In the US, they say, "Oh, I'm not, I'm the president of all Americans." It is not true. It is not true. In China, I've seen that, and I've seen how pragmatic they are, and it's not empty words and so on. So there's so much we could be learning from each other, really. But you see, that's the problem. Is that all society is too much individual centered. It's me, myself, and I, and we don't think in terms of community. What is the project or societal project? Society, what do we want to do? What you see in China, they think in terms of the next 50 years, the next 100 years. And they have ambitions for their own nation and actually also for the world. They're like, we have the Belt and Road Initiative. Do you want to join in? Because we have ambitions for the world. That's so inspiring. I mean, just think about, what they want to do. They're opening their arms. They say, who wants to join in? We are going to put the funding. We are hardworking, and we are looking for global prosperity. And it's and win-win. Those, and it's not only slogans. They deliver. They've been delivering for 40 years. They lifted out 800 million out of poverty, extreme poverty. They've been delivering all the time. Why don't we start learning from them? Not copy them. And you know what? And I like to say that Chinese, they don't want to export their system. They don't. And even, I'm going to be like cynical, but why would you want to export a system that is working to your competitors? You know what I mean? We are trying to export a system which is not working to people that have a system that is working. It doesn't make sense,
Oh, it makes sense for some people, but not for the people it actually affects.
Okay, so we have this question on the screen. I'm also going to add another one that I've seen asked many times. When or how does the current conflict in Ukraine end? And also U.S. elections, how is that going to impact what's going on regarding this conflict? And I will just say very quickly, if you study geopolitics, especially U.S. foreign policy and its interventions all around the globe, these are plans that are cooked up decades ago that continue moving forward no matter who is in the White House and no matter who is in Congress. Think tanks are funded by special interests to draw up these plans. It goes to Washington with lobbyists to be rubber stamped. It goes to the corporate media to be sold to the American public. That is how all of this works. So if these special interests want to keep pursuing proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, then they're going to continue doing that, no matter who wins the upcoming U.S. election. Scott, and then Angelo, how and when do you see this conflict ending in Ukraine?
So if you're looking at it from a Western perspective, what I think the West is going to look for after this Ukrainian counteroffensive, unless there's some massive success, some collapse of the Russian military, I think that they're going to look for sort of a Syria style situation where they end up freezing the conflict. They can extend it for the next 6-8 years and really establish the Ukraine that's left as, it's their little insulated pocket there. And what Brian was saying about this being planned in advance, Ukraine has been in the books since the 1950s. I mean, it's always been looked at as a way to exploit Russia, use them against Russia. It's always been there. So this is not a new idea. But I think that a frozen conflict would suit the U.S. I think that would be a way that they can continue selling arms. They continue, bolstering NATO's now depleted arms situation. They continue to buy time. I don't think that the Russians are going to allow this to happen. I think that they've been led by the nose one too many times. I think it would look incredibly bad for Putin. I think you're seeing Syria starting to warm up again for the exact reasons. The Russians are in the position of strength right now, especially after this Ukrainian counteroffensive fails. They have the time on their side. The West is going to have a very difficult time convincing Zelensky to go to the negotiating table. I think he knows that will be the end for him. And if he does that, it's over, which could actually lead to his demise in a different way, where they need to get him out and put somebody in place who will actually freeze the conflict. Will Russia negotiate with that new puppet government? If that ends up happening, I don't think so either. I just don't see the Russians moving fast on this, being in any rush. I think that they see this as a way to bleed the West, continue to bleed the West. Germany is already in a recession. They're looking at dropping out of the top, major economies in the next 10 to 15 years now, without cheap Russian energy, and their industrial base collapsing. And, as Germany goes, the rest of the EU will follow suit. That it's something that's going to have a domino effect. And they can't afford Ukraine forever. The financial support going into Ukraine is extremely high. And the EU also has to think about Greece and Italy and these other places that they help maintain. It's just another burden on an already very weak EU. So I don't think that the EU is necessarily in line with the US's ambitions on this right now. And you see that in the rhetoric coming out of these countries. I think Britain is still handily in line. I don't think that they're ever going to change their position. But as the economic situation begins to worsen, I think Europe is going to look for a more feasible end to this. The U.S. wants a frozen conflict, and I don't think Russia wants anything right now. I think that they're very happy with the way things are going. They're going to continue this. I think that the Russians are preparing for another 2 to 3 years of this until the West support dies, and then they can do as they wish in Ukraine, because as soon as that support starts coming in, as soon as salaries stop getting paid, things are going to start getting difficult. And I think that that's what the Russians are going to wait for. I think that's been the plan for the last year or so since the Russians mobilized.
Angelo, would you like to add anything to that?
I agree with most of what Scott said. I think the support in EU will go down and down. I think people they tend to focus on how much EU is spending in military spending, but actually it's nothing compared to the cost of in economics. The economic cost is probably 10 times more, but actually it's not. It's going to be constant. It's not a one-off. When you have a military spending, it's one-off. The losses in terms of desindustrialization of Europe, and especially Germany, is going to be the next 10, 15 years. It's going to be a big pain. We are talking about trillions of dollars. So people should not focus on military spending. And I think there are advanced indicators, especially our regime change when it comes to Germany. You've seen the news. They're trying to ban the AfD, the party, what they call far right, but they had their own standards to call far right. This party has over 30% of support, and it's been going skyrocketing. They're trying to outlaw that party. The excuse of outlawing this party is that it's because we want to protect democracy. Imagine, you want to outlaw a party which has 30% of support just to protect democracy. And you know what? It reminds me one thing. It reminds me that actually Hitler came into power with the same argument. Hitler, he went into power because he said, you know what? I need to protect Germany from the communists. And that's pretty much how he got into power. So you see, Germany, it's helpless. I'm not for ideology driven. I don't care. Labels, I've said it over and over. I don't care about the labels, left, right, all mixed up. I'm for self-determination. People decide for their own fate. But sometimes it's just ridiculous. The definitions they, like they have when it comes to democracy. So I'm
Just-
hoping it's going to turn. The opinion is going to turn, and AfD hopefully. I mean, if Germany loses, is not going along, then it's over.
Yeah, I was going to say that Germany doesn't have the best track record for squashing far right popularism, so they got to be careful, especially with the economy degrading the way it is. I mean, it's just going to get more and more popular. Germany first, right? I mean, it's not even a bad idea. It tends to lead to bad things, but the initial idea behind preserving Germany is it's going to just grow in popularity because the people in power don't care.
But by definition, why would you elect a leader that is not going to put your country's interest first? Exactly. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. You need to have a leader that says, you know what, I'm going to work for you and for my country first. So when you have those leaders, for example, Meloni, she was selected by the Aspen Institute. Aspen Institute is an institute that works for U.S. interest and for the globalist agenda. So you elected someone that is being groomed by U.S. think tank, and she says clearly, I'm for NATO and I'm for this globalist agenda. As an Italian, why would I vote for you? Why would I vote for you? It doesn't make any sense. So you see, but the problem is now they're telling people, well, you are populist, you are, it's like far right. They've labeled far right if you put your country first. It's the same as your family. It's like let's microcosm. Why should I focus on my neighbor when I have my family? You focus about your kids first, right? It's the same. It's the same. You focus about your city first, but who cares? I mean, why Europe is fighting for a country that is so far away and that doesn't care about our own interest? Because we saw it. Nord Stream 2, you destroy Europe economy, and you call that a friend?
Well, that was Ukraine, right?
Was Russia? Russia. We saw Putin. He was there. Putin. He left his ID card. We found the ID card.
He held his breath, went down 300 feet, and he broke it with his bare hands. He snapped
out his fingerprints off of the actual pipeline.
Well, what I want to add to what Angelo is saying, the EU is a bureaucratic layer overriding and smothering European sovereignty. They want European people to believe national sovereignty and self-interest is poisonous, is toxic, is somehow Nazism, even as the EU, this bureaucracy is aiding the US in actually arming literal Nazis in Ukraine. So it's about maintaining this political capture of Europe and deterring people from even wanting to have sovereignty and self-determination. Link it to Nazism and make it bad, all while you're actually arming Nazis.
And the most free, loving democracies in the world are constantly banning opposition parties that are growing in popularity. That is definitely not something a fascist government does. You're calling somebody, it's the pot calling the kettle black. Le Pen is some far right nationalist that wants something good for Ukraine, and you're any far right group, and you're trying to ostracize them with this title. In the meantime, you're doing exactly what you're afraid of. You're banning opposition, you're tightening down on information control, and you're partnering the private industry with the government. It's fascism light that pretends it's not fascism.
I want to throw something challenging here. What is worse? Is it someone who is a Nazi and he has this ideology, or is it someone that actually is actually manipulating the fact and not accepting there's Nazis? You see, my point is, what I want to say is that sometimes I can talk to anybody. Actually, ideas. You can talk about ideas, but what I find the most insulting is people that don't look at facts. They're not factual. I think this is most insulting because we do the work. But if someone is Nazi and he says clearly he's a Nazi, well, we can talk. Actually, I might learn something. Let's see, let's talk, because those are ideas. The most insulting is the one that are not, they're manipulating the facts.
Yeah.
And that's insulting. I get so angry. You Nazi? Well, we can talk. And maybe, some Nazis are, I remember in the 70s in Switzerland we had neo-Nazis, but because it was cool, it was a look, was punk, it was, but in reality they were not, they were not so racist, it was just the cool thing to do, unlike the real Nazis that you have in Ukraine right now.
And if you want Nazis to not be around, give them a platform to speak on. Let them expose their own bad ideas. Because if you want something to grow, say that it's bad, say that it's not okay. And they do have some good ideas for Germany, right? That's the whole thing, is you're thinking Germany first. And people will look at this and go, well, you're telling me to not be a part of this, but they're saying things that are good for Germany, right? And then and then through that you propagate the negative aspects of fascism and far right and so on. But if you actually give them a platform and you expose their bad ideas for what they are, then people are going to look at it and go, well, maybe a more moderate position is is actually more beneficial for the country that I'm in.
What I would say is that I think Nazis they've already had a platform. I think we all know what their ideas are. I think we've already concluded this debate. The thing that I don't understand or I find problematic is linking everything to Nazism, while actually arming and funding and promoting.
We got to be careful.
It's unreal.
We got to be careful. We don't have a lot of hair. People are going to start getting the wrong idea about this live stream.
But again, as Angelo always says, it's a matter of national sovereignty. If a nation, like say Germany, they want to outright ban Nazism, you can't blame them for that. That's their red line. That's their decision. The problem is, even though they've done that, they're making all the same mistakes all over again, and it's not being debated because you're not allowed to talk about it. You're not allowed to bring this up, or it's being diluted, or it's being clouded, and I think that is a real problem. But at the end of the day, this is what the West has been doing. This is what the West has been doing. You look at World War II, you look at these nations. Yes, the Nazis were horrible and they had to be stopped, and Russia stopped them. The Soviet Union stopped them. But they were fighting with other imperialist nations that already had empires, the British, even the Americans. This is a continuous problem that the West has had. It is imperialism, and they try to contain all of it with just Germany and pretend like it's not happening anymore, or somehow they were the good guys when they were all bad guys. They're all bad guys that had to be stopped. The Nazis were thankfully stopped. The British Empire and the U.S. that picked up the British Empire and now carries it forward, they still need to be stopped.
Yeah, I want to point out one thing. It's I'm going to be challenging, provoking a little bit, but sometimes I find those ultra liberal to have some fascist trait. Actually, they do. Yeah, they are imposing. They are a violent, very aggressive minority imposing on the majority. I mean, things that people don't want. I'm talking about LGBT and climate change. I mean, extremely aggressive. You know what? When you have average Joe that actually has a normal life, he has to pay the bills. It might be boring, but that's the reality. He's focusing on the tangible thing, and that's 95% of the people. And you have this silent, you have this aggressive minority, and that are imposing, and they're very powerful, and they're imposing values on the rest. And I think this is the new fascist. It's disguised in something like, oh, we want equality, human rights, and so on. It's not. It's exactly the opposite. Because what look at what they're standing for. I mean, it's disgusting. I mean, and it's not respectful for us. I mean, really, because it's about mutual respect. Why am I imposing my value on you? No. Why would you impose to my kids? I'm not going to go into the details, but we need to be careful. And those are the new fascists.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at how they approach every topic, it's the same way the brown shirts and the black shirts did in Italy and Germany. They show up, they yell everybody down, they don't let anybody talk, and they suppress ideas through their outrage, through their moral grandstanding or whatever you want to call it. It's definitely just fascism with pretending it's not fascism. The Antifa movement, the anti-fascist movement, is literally a group that goes around masked up and doesn't allow people to communicate ideas. It's the single most fascist thing you could do. I've never understood it. Listen, I disagree with a lot of what very stingent pro-Ukrainians say, very ideologically driven, but I don't think that they shouldn't be able to speak. I have bad ideas. They have bad ideas. People should be able to determine which of these ideas are good and bad on their own and not be silenced. I mean, I have everybody knows who's in the pro-Ukrainian information or in the Ukrainian information space, who NAFO is. All they do is try to silence, discredit, and get you banned from stuff. I mean, it's like their whole group's, I don't know, what would you say? Their whole mantra, their whole ethical code is getting people removed for having counter ideology. And that is just, it's the definition of fascism.
And hypocrisy. I just want to throw out, do you remember in the US they had these protests and they set up like an autonomous zone in some downtown? Yes. And they said there's no police here. So there's no police. So then obviously all the problems that you have when there's no police around. So they had guys going around telling you what to do, and if you didn't do it, they would beat you up, just like they were accusing them.
It's like the
police of doing.
The police, but unhinged police.
So I think human beings in general have a very long way to go before they start to, you have to go out into the world. You have to have a real job. You have to work. You have to make stuff. You have to work with other people and see how it all actually works. Because why you never hear me talking about ideology or promoting ideologies, because I honestly don't believe in any ideology. I want to work with everyone on something constructive that is in our best interest. You don't even need to, if you're building a water tower for your village, you don't need to talk about ideology when you're doing that. You need to talk about engineering and physics and how you're going to finance it. Yeah.
And if you want people to dig their heels in and really start believing what they believe in, even if you think the idea is wrong, is to approach it militaristically, like come at them angrily, try to ban them, whatever you're trying to do. If you're going at it in an aggressive fashion, that just convinces people that they're right. The best way to approach this is to talk to people and really present an articulate argument that can persuade them into thinking differently. You're not trying to change their mind. You're just trying to get them to think about what they're saying and why they're saying it, and try to convince them in that way. If you yell at people, if you shout people down, if you try to silence them, what word am I looking for here? It really makes them believe what they're saying is true. I mean, why would you be so angry about it if it didn't have some truth, right? Like the whole anger approach just doesn't work.
I think it comes down to every time to what unites people and set aside the differences. If you realize how much people they focus on the differences we have, when in reality, if you just focus on what unites us, and it comes down and you just realize that we are actually exactly seeking the same thing. The rest are all details, and they're focusing on the details. But ultimately, we are human beings. We want to put food on the table. We want our quality of life to be better every year. We want to raise our kids. We want to have a healthy life. You know what? If you're Nazi, if you're communist, or whatever, you are seeking exactly the same thing. After, the small details, if sexual preferences, those are small details that you live in your bedroom and don't impose onto the other people. But if you focus on what unites us, just think about it. What unites us? As simple as that. And then, and that's what Chinese are doing. They're like, oh, well, you know what? With India, we have many problems. Okay, we have those problems, border problems, and so on. But why don't we put them on the side? We'll work on that. We'll solve that. Over time, we're gonna solve that. Focus on what we can work together. What do we have in common? We can trade. You have this, I have this. Oh, you want to ditch the dollar? Okay, let's gonna do some swap agreement and so on. and that's mature. While what we have in the West is on purpose. That's a divide and control people. They're dividing people over hundreds of issues, and they've done it. Colonialism was always about this. How could they control billions of people miles away, because thousands of miles away, because that's how they do it. And constantly, it's every time like this. It's divide and conquer.
Well, I was just going to say, when you're thinking about how to deal with other people politically, just look at, if you believe in multipolarism and you want to invest in it, look at how nations investing in multipolarism conduct their diplomacy around the globe. Look at China and what it stands for. And look how it's working with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, if you're an ideological purist, there's no way for these two nations to work together. But if you're practical, yes, they have to work together. And over time, as they build on common ground, I think they're both going to go in a direction that is better for both of them. And a lot of the things that Saudi Arabia had been doing that people might think is questionable or objective, they're going to move past that, because they don't need to do that. Salafism, for example, a militarized extremist version of Islam used for advancing their political agenda at home and abroad, they won't need this anymore if they're working with China and the rest of the multipolar world. So, and you have to be patient, and you have to build common ground with people. They're not going to agree with you on everything on the first day you talk to them. So I think, let's see, so we really diverted from the question of when is the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Yeah,
I think that is important, because we need to go around. We have a micro, macro, and then society and values, because it comes down to this. We are, there's a civilization war here. It's a continuation of that civilization war. Try one powerful minority trying to impose on the majority.
Yeah, don't get hung up on ideology. It's okay to have ideology as a guiding light. Yeah. Don't let it become a straitjacket, and don't let it be something that you find yourself fighting with other people over when you should be building common ground.
I think that people find a certain comfort in ideology and having all of the answers presented to them. I know that where I sit, from my position, I am probably one of the least ideologically driven people ever. Like, I just don't have. I'm sort of a nihilist. I'm very pragmatic in my thinking, and I don't have any strong, religious or nationalistic ideas or anything like that. I just like to remove myself completely from the equation, and I think that is something that people have a very hard time doing, but I think it's something that's very necessary when you're actually looking for truth in a very complex and large, almost overwhelming world that we live in.
It reminds me a metaphor. Deng Xiaoping, when there was he started with this policy opening up and reforms of China. He actually said it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches the mouse. Yeah. And I like so basically you are going to choose the system. It doesn't matter. You want to catch the mouse, so it doesn't matter. You are going to choose the tools for that. And I like also when Brian used that, when you're building a house, you are going to use not one tool. You're not going to use just a hammer. You are going to use many different tools. So it doesn't matter. So ideology are just tools, but ultimately you need to build that house. And if you look at politics at the local level, just think about politics at the local level. I was into politics. I was elected in the city council of my city, and when you are going to build let's say a kindergarten, what does it change if you are from the left or the right? We all have kids. You are going to build a kindergarten. Maybe we are going to be different on colors, but otherwise doesn't change much ultimately, really. And again, if people need to understand that it's if there is a fight, what is the fight? Is the 1% against the 100%, 99%. Sorry, I was gonna do a bear buck moment, 1%. No, it's the 1% against the 99%. So and they, imagine how the fear they have that the 99% unite, because ultimately it's a 1%. And that's what, that's what I call the globalist elites. They control everything, and they don't care about human being. They don't care about countries. They don't care about you. It's how they can hold on to power. There's no borders. They want to destroy everything, and that's the real fight.
Yeah, and it all comes down to stopping conflicts, ongoing conflicts, and bigger conflicts, including a potential world war. And we have, just as you're saying, Angela, the elite, this tiny percentage that actually run and control things and drive foreign domestic policy, when they're fighting these wars, they're not paying for it. It's not their blood. It's not their territory. It's not their homes or family members. It's everyone else on their behalf, and they have no incentive to stop. So when you allow yourself to be divided like this and fed into these conflicts, that is what's going to continue to perpetuate them. So we can't just ask them nicely or even ask them angrily to stop. We have to drain the swamp that is actually fueling this. They're a very small percent, and they're able to do this because they're able to manipulate people, control them, pit them against each other. It's imperialism 101. Yeah, and that's what's going on in Ukraine.
Yeah, I just want to add. I mean, just we simplify. I mean, most of the time we simplify because it's difficult for people to go too deep. But in reality, so we simplify. We say, well, that's the U.S. and that's the Europe and so on. But in reality, countries are tools. The people. We have. It's at the higher level. It's the World Economic Forum. It's Bilderberg. It's the richest families. The most powerful elites, and those people, they're actually using countries. But ultimately, it's not the U.S. against that. If you have a higher view, it's those globalist elites, and those are all the big families, and Bill Gates and so on. Those people in the background, and sometimes they're not even you don't even hear their names much. But those are the real ones that rule the world. But but we need to simplify. We need to say countries because it goes quite deep. Just to understand, there are shadow institutions like the Bilderberg. I did some studies lately on the Bilderberg group. That most of the European leaders and actually US leaders too, before being elected, before even being candidate, they are co-opted. They are pre-selected. First by think tanks, or some young global leaders, World Economic Forum. But the last step is actually the Bilderberg Group. And when you look at the attendees of the Bilderberg Group, most of them, just before being elected, they went through the Bilderberg Group. So I have many examples, like Bill Gates, he was just, and every time it's like two years before, he was not even a candidate, he was a governor. He went to Bilderberg Group, and basically it's the whole pre-selection. So those candidates that you are going to see in the US, they've been pre-selected. Vivek is portraying himself as being this guy, this newcomer, like he's telling you what you want to hear. Well, dig a little bit. He was funded by not George Soros, the brother of Soros Foundation. He got $90,000 back then, so they pre-selected, and then he's a pure product from the World Economic Forum. He's been working closely with the. So why and again, he's going, if he's candidate, let's say if he's in the last round, he's going to be against someone who has the same background. So those are pre-selected candidates. So it's important to understand that there are institution groups, shadow governments that are above, and ultimately when you talk about president, I think presidents have very limited powers. There's formal power and informal powers.
Yes. And that's why ultimately, like, you'll never hear me talking about the U.S. elections because it doesn't matter. It didn't matter. You had Bush Jr. to Obama to Trump to Biden. If you didn't tell me there was an election and there was a different president, I'm just looking at U.S. foreign policy, I would not have seen any difference at all. And I know that might upset some people who are Trump supporters, but he did kill General Soleimani. he was setting the stage. He was sending weapons to Ukraine. It wasn't him doing it, obviously. He's just sitting there in the office while these things continue to unfold. Because it has a momentum of its own, and it spans decades. It doesn't matter who's in office. So it's empire. We're past 2 hours. I think we could probably go on for another hour once we get off into these kind of conversations. But we'll probably be doing this again very soon. I want to thank Scott and Angelo for joining me. Scott, why don't you tell people where they can find, follow, and support your work?
Yeah, so if you guys want to follow my Telegram, that's where I post the most, I would say, analytic information about the Ukraine war. If you want to follow me on Twitter, that's a little bit more entertainment. I, push people's buttons sometimes. I still get information out on Twitter, but it's definitely a hobby for me. If you want to follow my YouTube, Calibrated with Scott, I post on there regularly. And if you like my work and you want to support me, please go follow my Patreon. I'll be posting episodes on there that are not so important to the actual conflict. I like all my content to be free to everybody, but those will be more fun conversations and interviews with people that I find interesting. So if you like my work and you want to support me, those are the ways you can do that. And I appreciate everybody who does support me.
Yes, and Angela, where can people find and follow your work?
So mainly on Twitter, that's my main platform. I have a YouTube channel. I haven't been active lately. Otherwise, just as a guest, New Atlas, RT, sometimes Galloway show. And if people want to support me, there's a link. Buy me a coffee, and that's all. I think, but I think it's mostly important to say, well, it's mainly about the purpose of the fight. I mean, you're fighting for, that's why we're here. I think the two of us, that's most important is get the message out there, and I think also just I think if we can contribute in terms of pushing people just to think more, to have this approach of asking questions. Sometimes it's very counterintuitive, and it's about just doing the homework, and I think if we can provide something, it's just the tools to people. Just letting them know, you need to dig, and what are the foundations to understand the geopolitical landscape. Yeah.
Yes, and I will post all of these links in the video description below, and in a pinned comment at the top of the comment section. I just saw someone say, wasn't General Soleimani a world terrorist? I mean, if that's what you think, I don't even know how you found this channel. No, he wasn't. He was actually fighting ISIS. And the U.S. assassinated him because ISIS are America's proxies. They were using them as a proxy army in Syria, and they were using them as a pretext to remain indefinitely militarily in Iraq and beyond. So, we have a long way to go. Angela, you're talking about informing people.
But the problem that we have is that you see, people they say one thing. It's just they've heard it, once, and they just repeat it. And I mean, sometimes there's things we don't know, and we are going to dig, and we are going to spend 30 minutes. We are going to do the whole homework, and then they say, okay, well, but then they are going to come up with something else. And the problem is that people, they take shortcuts, and they say something, and we have to do the whole homework, really, and it's unfair. I get angry for that, really, because they say, they are oversimplification, and you dig into it, you spend time, and you say, oh, well, no, it's this and that. And I think it's important. It's about spending time doing the homework, and that's what we're doing. But it's time consuming. It's 16 hours a day, actually. If you're into this, it's so much, and it's always like questioning. It's we do quest examination between us. We learn from each other, and we try. Sometimes we don't have the whole answer. Sometimes we make mistakes. And we come back and we say, well, I did make a mistake, but it's doing the homework, really, and just try to avoid oversimplification too.
And
yes.
I don't think people really do understand how much we do this. I mean, we work and we also do this, and it's plateful, to say the least. Yeah, I spend a good amount of time doing this. I wake up at like 4:30 every morning and start reading. It's like it's what I do, because that's Ukraine time, right? That's when things start popping up in the news. So yeah, it's a lot of work.
Yes, it is. And well, maybe we could do another episode about that as well. So anyway, everyone, again, Scott, Angelo, thank you for joining me. Everyone who tuned in live, thank you. If you're watching this recorded, please like and share, and please check the video description below for all the additional information. And until next time, bye for now.
Bye, guys.